Anno 1800 released last year to much fanfare from the Anno community. It was seen as the return to the historically popular formula that propelled the series into cult classic status, after the mixed reception received from their latest installment in the franchise, Anno 2205. Today, with more than a year since its release, coupled with the addition of 2 season passes, we look back on the game and assess whether it deserves to stand on the podium of the great Anno titles. In this video, we will cover the game's presentation, with its graphics, performance, and music, its premise and how well its semi-historical setting is executed, its gameplay mechanics and how well they have been improved and reworked over previous Anno titles, its campaign and storyline, before finally judging its post-release development and modding support over the past year or so. This is Anno 1800, a year in review. By 2015, the German-based Blue Byte division had officially released 3 mainstream PC Anno games to date: the Renaissance and Discovery Age Anno 1404, the futuristic, climactically altered Earth in 2070, and the spacefaring, moon-colonizing age of Anno 2205. Their predecessor studios had already established the Anno series as a popular city-building game series with an emphasis on economic simulation, long-term strategy, and resource management, but it was really the 1404 and 2070 titles of the last decade which propelled the game into worldwide renown and garnered its cult following. 2205 was the last title before 1800 and saw the studio take a relatively different approach, streamlining its sometimes meticulous and deep mechanics for a more casual experience, perhaps aimed at a wider audience. This led to mixed reception from the self-dubbed Annoholics, who saw the differentiation from previous games too large. In my opinion, Anno 2205 was a beautiful game graphically, and it was the first time the Anno series would venture to places such as the moon and simulate futuristic ideas we may well see in our own timeline, showcasing the possibilities such as lunar colonization, helium-free mining, and long-range energy transfer. The game sacrificed the complex micromanagement aspects of previous titles that made it popular in the first place, but it is in no regards a bad game. It still plays extremely well to this day. It just isn't the full Anno experience you expect if you've grown up with the old titles. Fast forward to 2019, Anno 1800 was released with Blue Byte returning to form to the fundamentals of the Anno series, but modernizing its mechanics to provide a refreshing new age city builder, almost as a metaphor to the time period it is covering, allowing both returning players and new players to equally enjoy the game. Anno 1800, as its name suggests, covers the 1800s, centered around the Industrial Revolution, the major thematic emphasis. Other themes covered focus on the tumultuous history of Europe in this period, including political revolutions and reform, the introduction of steam, electricity and mass production, the exploitation of overseas colonies, the naval arms race, Victorian-era public culture, and the flourishing of trade and emergence of globalization. Honestly, this game touches on so many themes of the late 19th century that it will surely pique the interest of anyone with a keen eye for modern history, even though the game itself isn't a pure historical game. Season 1 Pass was quickly announced and released a few months after the base game, adding 3 new DLCs. Sunken Treasures introduces treasure hunting mechanics, a new continent-sized island, and a campaign inspired by the Napoleonic Battle of Trafalgar. Botanica DLC introduces a new mechanic based on the fledgling botanical culture that was growing in Europe around this time. Finally, the Season Pass finishes off strongly with the Passage DLC, introducing the Arctic region and inspired by the lost British expedition to find the Northwest Passage in the 1850s. Season 2 Pass is currently adding another 3 DLCs, currently in its rolling out phase, and as of writing of this video, the first 2 DLCs of Season 2 Pass have already been released, the final DLC rolling out later this year. First, in this review video, we will cover the base game and the content of the Season 1 Pass, including the Anarchist DLC, but a later Season 2 Pass review will follow at the end of the year. Anno 1800 has its roots in familiar territory, especially for returning players to the series who will immediately recognize the similarities. Its simple premise serves to be an almost foreboding curtain raiser to the rest of the game, whilst limiting the difficulty barrier for new players who have some experience in the city building genre. The fundamental premise is that you are a company, authorized by the crown to establish a trade empire, competing against other companies in a fictionalized, semi-historical 1800 setting. By building a city, expanding and upgrading your population by providing certain goods and services, you can outpace your competitors' incomes, completing your victory conditions, and win the game. Or if you're playing sandbox, play until your heart's desire. All the mechanics in between becomes one hell of an Anno gameplay experience. Like in previous titles, establishing your company is the first thing you'll do in Anno 1800. Here you can change your name, portrait, company color and logos. Most of these logos are, however, behind DLC paywall or the Ubisoft reward system. Quite frustrating, but that's the nature of the modern game industry. As a company, you will be technically under the rule of the Crown, headed by the Queen and represented by Sir Archibald Blake, obviously a play on the British Empire and its relationship with its imperial chartered companies. Think of it like the Hudson's Bay Company or Virginia Company that the English established in North America. Although your allegiance is with the Crown, you have been empowered to self-govern. In return, they will siphon off a bit of your income as royal taxes. As your company attracts higher population levels, these royal taxes will increase. Besides this, there will be very little other interactions with the crown during gameplay. Given the huge importance of overseas business entities that existed during the 1800s by the British and other colonial powers, it is somewhat disappointing we don't have more meaningful interactivity. Anno 1800 offers two modes of play. The first is a campaign mode, which also serves as the game's tutorial. We will discuss the campaign later on in the video. The gameplay mode most indicative of the Anno series is Sandbox, played against the AI or other players in a lobby format, either offline or multiplayer, sort of like in the Civilization series. Sandbox can be played, as Sandbox suggests, without any objectives, but you can also set a variety of victory conditions, such as economic or population targets, or the classic monumental victory. You can tweak many of the settings to increase or reduce difficulty. This means that players have a lot of flexibility to either choose to play indefinitely in true creative sandbox fashion or with set targets in mind for a more competitive experience. But this isn't new and has been around for all the other Anno games. All players begin in the Old World, the base region which represents temperate Europe and the setting of your main city. This region can be customized with the map type and map seed, making every Old World different every playthrough. There will always be at least 4 major islands for each of the players to establish as their home base, and numerous other smaller ones. The Crown's advisor and spokesperson, Sir Archibald Blake, will also spawn somewhere here as an NPC. You have to find him first by exploring the region, and he usually sells a variety of naval vessels and shipping related items. Importantly, he will buy virtually anything you produce at a reduced price, so he is a good early game buyer for any excess stockpile. Other NPCs include Madame Kahina, who operates an emporium selling exotic cultural items such as zoo animals and museum artifacts, as well as sometimes offering seeds, very useful if your islands lack certain fertilities. Wormway's prison will also spawn in the Old World, governed by Ellie Bleakworth. He sells many specialist and lore-themed items and trades several varieties of unrefined materials, both useful for the mid to late game. Depending on your lobby settings, you can also enable the pirate of this region, Anne Harlow, initially hostile to all players. She is fortified in an impressive defensible cove and will harass the entire region with her ships, but can be allied through shrewd diplomacy. This is thus the largest and most feature-dense base region we've ever seen in an Anno game, with a 1600 by 1600 grid, making it significantly larger than the 2070 map, which has a similar amount of islands, but even dwarfing the maps of the latest Anno game, 2205. Anno 2205 introduced the feature of distinct separated regions, and this feature has been expanded even further to be much more deep and interactive in 1800. Besides the old world, there are a number of current and upcoming new regions that significantly expand the scope of the game, central to the experience of creating a global trade empire. The first region you'll encounter is the New World, unlocked after reaching a certain population milestone. This is a region with a tropical climate based on the Caribbean and features a number of islands supporting a range of exotic resources. Expansion here is critical in the mid to late game, as all the exclusive resources here will be utilized in some way. Here, the main NPC is Isabel Sarmento, a freedom fighter leading a revolution, probably in reference to the number of political revolutions that sprouted in the Caribbean region during this time. She is situated on an anchor-shaped island and deals with New World-related specialists, seeds, and resources, as well as selling her own handful of ships. Another pirate can be activated in this region, Jean La Fortune, a noticeably more difficult pirate NPC to negotiate with diplomatically, but he does start at peace with players when you first encounter him. Cape Trelawney was added with the first major DLC, Sunken Treasures. This adds a new region adjacent to the old world that also unlocks after certain population milestones. Although possessing virtually the same resources as the old world, it provides a huge continental island with immense building space for a grand city. Additionally, this region also ties in with an introduced campaign, new mechanics, and a new NPC, which we will discuss later on in the video. The Arctic is the latest region introduced, arriving with the Passage DLC. This introduces a beautiful region in the north where players again unlock at a certain population milestone. The Arctic features smaller islands but has exclusive resources that are useful, especially in the construction of airships. A new campaign and NPC are also introduced, and again we will discuss this further in depth later. The entire scope of Anno 1800 can easily be viewed in the world map screen, which shows the regions in their corresponding biomes. It also showcases the new region which will be introduced in Land of Lions DLC based on the African continent. In essence, this is the most ambitious Anno game in terms of scope, and its semi-historical 1800s world building is already vastly more complex than previous titles, with every region offering a dramatically different experience to a game that is definitely not lacking in depth. Continuing off Anno 2205's wonderful graphics engine, Blue Byte has once again shelled out heavily in the graphics department. Anno 1800 invokes a mixture of Victorian-era art and culture with an industrial steampunk vibe, combining the best of both worlds. On ultra settings, this is a remarkably beautiful game seen from above, and it's one of those engines where attention to detail is quite apparent. In the old world, a temperate biome is showcased featuring woodlands and open grasslands filled with deer, moose, wolves and bears. The tropical New World is filled with clay-banked rivers meandering through dense jungle, angelic waterfalls and pristine beaches. The new Arctic region introduced in the Passage DLC is my favourite. It's so desolate yet so peaceful, and it's a region that the developers have executed well before, such as in Anno 2205. New features added since release include the day and night cycle, which introduces night lighting effects and a new dynamic to the visuals, further enhancing the beauty factor of the engine. Building and ornamental models are nicely designed with variability to reduce repetitiveness, and there is some historical progression as the game plays out. Basic starting farmer huts have a homely French cottage feel. The worker and artisan houses evoke English Georgian architecture of the early 1800s, whilst the late game residences of the engineers and investors are inspired by Haussmann's Parisian architecture of the late 1800s. The vibe and atmosphere of a large, bustling metropolis must be truly appreciated on the ground level, where small details stand out, such as town squares, lamp posts, and decorations, despite the muddy texture resolution at this level. Anno games have always been known for featuring some of the best in-game music. Blue Byte have extensively collaborated with Dynamedion on all their previous games, and they returned to produce Anno 1800 soundtrack. I still think their best work was with the 2070 soundtrack, but Anno 1800's music is definitely no pushover. With a clear classical tone matching the cultural enlightenment and humanistic enthusiasm of the Victorian era, the soundtrack in this game has a huge mix of tonally distinct sounds that echo different emotions. There are inspiring, almost intoxicating tracks combining church choirs and string symphonies to deliver anthems with a lot of bravado and heart. They remind me a lot of 2070's best tracks, which were also uplifting, almost spiritual in nature. There are other, more melancholic tracks made with just piano, harp and violin instruments. The Passage DLC is a prime example of this, with the Arctic themes painting a picture of a world so cold, desolate, yet mystically beautiful. It's very reminiscent of Dynamedion's work in Anno 2205 with their themes of the lunar region, with both music evoking an idea of loneliness at humanity's farthest frontiers. There are also New World specific tracks inspired by Latino culture, featuring the accordion and guitar. Hilariously, there was a long-standing bug where only one certain music track would play in-game, and it's only been recently fixed in the last update, so I think the entire soundtrack warrants a second judgment in another extended playthrough, but it's definitely another strong addition to the collection of Anno soundtracks. The Botanica DLC brings a bit of nostalgia back as well, where the player can construct a musical pavilion and enjoy string versions of beloved tracks from the previous titles. Many of the tracks are played in the background of this video to give viewers a sense of what they're after. The user interface of this game is probably the most well-designed and refined UI of the entire series, and has been worked on extensively in post-release, with the developers constantly tweaking and adding new features to streamline the many gameplay mechanics available. Anno games are at their core resource management games, and the interface allows the player to grasp every single information and statistic about their city's supply and demand, and adjust their production accordingly. It's the first Anno game where you can truly create ultra-efficient min-max supply networks simply at a glance with the in-game information, without having to consult external tools. Returning Anno players will love the complexity of the game being transferred effectively into this user interface, but this might scare new players as there is quite a lot of information being displayed on these screens. Old features such as the right-click menu and heads-up display have mostly returned with revamped features. At the top you can still see your major construction materials, as well as your overall economy, population and the like, with the new features such as influence and city attractiveness. The best part is the bottom section of the HUD, where the concise categories allow you to quickly select your desired building and see its production chain. You're rarely ever more than 3 mouse clicks away from achieving what you want in the game, whether that be building a new block of houses, panning your camera to a new theatre, or creating a new trade route. It's an intuitive UI design that greatly eases the playing experience of a highly complex and in-depth game. With this much graphical firepower, Anno 1800 is resultingly quite a demanding game. Although it is playable on most systems for the majority of the early to mid game, the late game is the real struggle even for high tier computers, especially once you reach about 10,000 population. Unfortunately, this will prevent budget players from truly enjoying this game, and I can only recommend to upgrade your system if it is older than 5 years if you wish to play Anno 1800. The game has also gotten quite a reputation for being unstable, and although vast improvements have been made since launch with now 8 major game updates, there are still various crashes that happen. Of infamy is the dreaded and widespread DirectX crash, which has been appearing on and off since launch, causing instant crashes to desktop and frustratingly forces a dependency on frequent autosaves. Personally, the game would crash for me every hour or so when it first released last year. This has so far been alleviated in my recent playthrough this year, but I still would get the occasional crash. This is unfortunately an issue where we have to just trust the developers to keep improving the game's stability. Anno 1800 stands out from previous titles due to the fact the gameplay isn't fully linear. Whereas in previous titles there is an initial learning curve, but advancement of your city is fairly straightforward and there is clear linear progression. Anno 1800 instead forces 3 different learning curves in different stages of the game, which can be summarized as the early, the mid and the late game. These roughly equate to certain residential tiers. The early game consists of advancing from a village to a town, with farmers, then workers, then artisans, generally focused around an agriculture-based society. The early game is all about setting up your resources, exploring the unknown world around you, which is draped in fog of war, and thus initiating diplomatic contact with other players and forming the crux of your future city. This gameplay experience is very similar to previous Anno titles. The mid-game spikes in difficulty and introduces new mechanics once you attain engineers. In the mid-game, expansion is required to access exotic resources, so this will roughly be the time that players usually start settling in other regions, aggressively colonizing other islands, and expanding your trade and economic empire, and thus maybe indulging in a bit of warfare. This is also when your town starts to transform into a full-fledged city. The introduction of electricity and steam technology can also happen in the mid-game, though they can be delayed until the late game, depending on your priorities. The late game is the final major learning curve once you reach the final residential tier, the investors. Late game is the ascension of your city into a sprawling metropolis, the focus of which is culture and tourism. By the late game, construction of your monument begins, a possible win condition, requiring you to sustain enough of a population and thus producing or importing enough goods from your expansive trade empire. This is the stage where players also heavily utilize electricity to boost production, focusing on economic efficiency rather than expansion. Steamships dominate the late game, and decisive naval action at this stage often decides the winners and losers. So, let's go over the major gameplay mechanics and see how this improves or compares against previous Anno titles. The core interactivity with population mechanics in Anno 1800, like the previous Anno titles, is working your way up the residential tiers as your city grows and expands. As your population gets access to better goods and services, they are able to be upgraded, which allows them to perform more advanced and technical jobs, as well as paying more taxes. However, higher tier residences will have more difficult demands which need to be met to keep their happiness at reasonable levels. Unlike previous games which had a singular workforce resource, Anno 1800 forces you to maintain all residential tiers as jobs are now differentiated. For example, even though you might reach the late game with a huge sprawling metropolis, you still require basic farmers in some capacity to work your fields and grow your crops. Similarly, you also require workers, which are your primary labor force operating heavy industry. As a result, it is vitally important to cater to all residential tiers in this game, even though more than half of your residents may have already ascended past the stage of menial labor. Conversely, you no longer have to build offshore population centers to access resources on other islands. In the late game, investing influence can provide workforce for all your islands, which we'll expand upon later, or the construction of commuter piers, which allow your home workforce to travel offshore and thus completely alleviate the labor shortages you would usually encounter when tapping into resources on other islands. These mechanics in their entirety introduces a new dynamic that forces players to think more strategically. Instead of racing to upgrade as many residences as you can in previous games, players now have to consider issues such as population retention and producing a variety of goods to cater to all residential tiers, immediately improving the depth of Anno 1800 against its predecessors. Happiness is a new mechanic which adds a new layer of depth to the standard Anno gameplay. In previous titles, residences were either satisfied or not, depending on how many goods or services they had access to. In Anno 1800, providing basic goods and services only increases the amount of residences that move into a particular dwelling. As a result, providing a good supply only maxes out population. Keeping that population happy, however, is a completely different task altogether, and can be achieved through providing luxuries, reducing working hours, or the use of propaganda. Pollution and warfare will also impact your citizens' happiness. Unhappy citizens increase the chances of riots breaking out, causing strikes that disrupt the production chains and require the construction of police stations to quell. This plays heavily on the game's representation of the Age of Enlightenment, when the 1800s saw a rise in the pursuit of civil liberties for the common people. Luxuries is a new mechanic that allows the player to supply optional goods and services that improve happiness and tax income. I say optional because technically the residents do not need these to be satisfied in order to upgrade to the next tier. They only need basic ones, but the upside is potentially very lucrative. For example, starting farmers only require access to a pub and schnapps as a luxury, providing pretty measly income and happiness boost, but then again, farmers require very little in the first place to stay happy. Investors later on require such goods as pocket watches and jewelry and access to a members club, thus requiring imported goods and or very complicated production chains coupled with pricey maintenance costs and exclusive buildings. However, they provide insane tax income to compensate, and in the late game, maintaining a steady flow of luxuries is vital to your economy. Again, this plays on the theme of the late 1800s when luxuries became important economic sources as the world was increasingly becoming globalized. Representing the introduction of trade unionization and labor rights during this period, Anno 1800 introduces the ability to adjust working conditions for your workforce. Lowering productivity increases happiness, vice versa, increasing productivity lowers happiness. On the surface, this mechanic seems arbitrary, but it is in actual fact a very useful and well thought out gameplay feature. For instance, we examined the production chain of canned goods. Artisanal Kitchens produces goulash every 120 seconds, whereas the cannery produces canned food every 90 seconds. If we do the maths, we would require 4 artisanal kitchens for every 3 canneries in an ideal equalized ratio. Obviously way too many buildings. Instead, we can use the working conditions mechanic, lowering that of the cannery, forming a much more manageable 1-to-1 ratio suitable for the early and mid game. This mechanic thus can be utilized in many regards to equalize production ratios as an optimization technique in the late game. An extremely welcome design decision for this game which features so many variable productivity ratios. Increasing production efficiency can also be a quick way to produce emergency supplies in a pinch. For instance, I usually do this when I require weapons quickly during an enemy attack. Newspapers became widely accessible in the 1800s thanks to the invention of the steam-powered printing press, and this is represented as a new mechanic in Anno 1800. Every 30 minutes, a newspaper is issued with free articles highlighting recent events in your realm. These can negatively or positively affect public opinion, or can be neutral and have no consequential modifiers associated with them. Players, however, can invoke propaganda, using their influence to replace articles with a variety of templates to suit their purpose. For instance, a rum shortage could be reported in your newspaper, applying a small goods consumption increase across your population, but you can neutralize this with a distraction piece or even a hypnotic article that instead improves happiness. You can apply a variety of other propaganda pieces such as promoting austerity and thus reducing goods consumption, or encouraging the war effort and thus providing boosts to military production. The Anarchist DLC provides its own category of unique propaganda options as well. However, higher tier educated citizens such as engineers and investors will always see past propaganda, and you will receive a happiness penalty for using it at these tiers. So propaganda usage does become a double-edged sword in the late game, but their significant bonuses are, however, still very powerful if used correctly, and offers a fascinating strategic option for the players to control their population. In Anno 1800, specialists and items have been heavily expanded upon from previous games, equipable in ships or certain administrative buildings to provide a wide range of bonuses. Specialists and items invoke their own metagame of optimization. They can drastically affect late game playing styles and add an RPG element to the gameplay we've really yet to see before in Anno games. Specialists and items can be acquired in a number of ways: rewards from missions or expeditions, through trade, or from tourism and immigration. The Anarchist DLC also comes with a defection mechanic to obtain specialists, whilst the Sunken Treasures DLC introduces the diving bell ship, which can embark on treasure hunts as another method to obtain items. All of these specialists and items are divided based on their rarity: common, uncommon, rare, epics, and legendaries. Their effects are scaled accordingly, and so higher rarity items usually outperform lower ones. Equipping the right items for certain purposes is thus an important strategic investment from the player. Specialists or items equipped in ships boost the vessel's performance. In a harbour master's office, they affect coastal buildings and shipyards. In a trade union, they affect your industry, and in a town hall, they provide city-related effects. With a huge catalogue of different specialists and items with wide-ranging effects, capable of changing the way players strategize and optimize, this creates a unique experience every playthrough and assists the game's replayability. The advent of electricity is one of the more complex but satisfying learning curves in the entire Anno series, introducing the late game and changing up the dynamic quite considerably. The first time I experienced my own electrical revolution in game was the first time I really felt I had to learn the game from scratch, and realized many of my early to mid-game decisions could have been better planned in retrospect if I knew the ramifications or benefits of electricity. Electricity surprisingly is based around oil in this game. The first stages of electrification in the late 1800s were powered by coal steam engines, but since coal is treated as more of an early and mid-game commodity, I can understand the design decision to limit electricity to the much more difficult to obtain oil resource. Oil is drilled from the ground and transported to power stations or storage through a network of trains, presenting another city building design challenge to the player. From power stations, electricity is delivered to residents, which is a basic need for engineers and investors, but more importantly, can be delivered to industry. This is by far the most radical change to gameplay, as electrified industries double their productivity, so you can already imagine the endless possibilities of optimization by introducing this change into your city. It also enables certain late game industries that require electricity, such as steam motors, which in turn allows the production of steam powered ships. Since power stations and train tracks become critical components of city infrastructure in the late game, they have to be considered in early city planning. Furthermore, increasing reliance on electricity fuels the demand for oil, thus making expansion and conflict with other players inevitable, especially in the New World with its huge supply of oil reserves. The Passage DLC further adds an alternative gas resource and gas power stations to generate electricity, reducing the dependency on oil. Very rarely have I ever gotten the sensation of having to learn an Anno game from scratch, but the introduction of electricity and all its related mechanics really encourages strategic thinking, a recurring theme the developers have definitely tried to push in Anno 1800, which is why this game feels so rewarding. All military in this game is based on naval warfare, which it has been for the last 3 titles. This is one of the mechanics which hasn't really been innovated, but the differentiation introduced between sailing ships in the early to mid game and the steam ships of the late game again provides a learning curve to overcome. Wind and a ship's speed and agility are the defining factors of naval engagements early on. Utilizing tactical movements, you can turn around engagements where you are otherwise outgunned or outnumbered. These include crossing the T and allowing both sides of your ship to broad fire, or using a faster ship's mobility to sidewind maneuver around a slower vessel and deliver twice as much firepower than a usual side-on engagement. The introduction of steamships changes the tactical landscape once again, with wind-based movements proving irrelevant. In the late game, range is king, and whoever fires the first shot usually wins the battle, so equipping your battle cruisers or monitors with the right items and specialists is paramount. It's interesting to see the change of naval tactics echoed into the unit evolution as you progress through the game, when the 1800s itself saw the transition from wooden sailing ships to hybrid paddle steamers to ironclad monitors and then finally to steel steam ships. Military buildings also make a return, reducing the need to field a standing navy if you wish to pursue a more defensive approach. Mounted guns are cheap, medium-ranged guns which have high rate of fire. The cannon tower has great damage and long range, but a slow firing rate, whilst the Big Betty lobs huge shells that cause large explosions over immense ranges, but requires long reload times and can only be built on the shoreline. A balance of these fortifications can be useful for defending entire stretches of water if positioned correctly. Unfortunately, despite the amazing ambition of Anno 1800, military land units are not represented. And this is slightly disappointing there wasn't an attempt made here, especially with the rich military history of the time period, which covers the Napoleonic and Victorian eras. The last time land-based battles were implemented was in Anno 1404. They were admittedly kind of cumbersome and perhaps even unnecessary, but this game would have been a great opportunity to rework land combat, especially with the slower-paced, methodical tactics of the time featuring line infantry and artillery. It doesn't seem too impossible to implement. Regardless, this shouldn't be a criticism, more of wishful thinking. Trade, on the other hand, has been heavily expanded to encompass the massive scope of the game, and for such a crucial part of the Anno playing experience, this should come as no surprise. After Anno 2205's more hands-free approach to trade, Anno 1800 sees a return back to the classic in-depth approach Anno enthusiasts have grown to love with the older titles. However, Anno 1800 also gives options for newer or more casual players to automate their trade routes rather than engaging in the possibly meticulous micromanagement. In the trade screen, these options can be examined. Firstly, charter routes reworks the simplistic Anno 2205 system, useful for not only novice players but also for smaller routes which only require a single good to be moved, such as in the early game before you can afford to maintain trade ships. Charter routes are basically hired neutral ships and thus do not need to be protected in the event of war. Secondly, trade routes follow the standard formula of 2070, requiring a self-built trade vessel to be committed solely to its trade route, and would need protecting from piracy or enemies if it is unarmed. The advantage here is that they can be fine-tuned to carry multiple goods, visit multiple ports, or perform other complex orders. The Passage DLC also introduces airships, by far the most effective trading vessel, but quite expensive to build and maintain. With the deep options available to optimize trade route efficiency, I find this title to have the most pleasant trading simulation experience without sacrificing the classic complexity of Anno. Diplomacy has had minimal rework from older titles. Diplomacy involves pirate factions and other players, whether human or AI controlled. There are 4 possible diplomatic statuses: being at war, at peace, trading rights, or an alliance. With interactions that include flatter, insult, or offering gifts, the player can influence their respective diplomatic standing. Certain actions you do in the game world will also have a slight effect on diplomacy, with each AI personality reacting differently. For instance, some characters despise long working hours, or others dislike propaganda, so will penalize you diplomatically if these occur. Or buying a competitor's island shares and initiating a financial takeover is a great way to plummet relations. Overall, diplomacy is quite simplistic in this game, but it gets the job done. I just wish there was some more options such as economic assistance or combined military objectives for allies, or a more peaceful way to buy out islands rather than just warfare or financial takeover. I'm not expecting a total war diplomacy experience, but the system is virtually unchanged since Anno 2070, so there is definitely room for improvement here. Disasters and managing them are another classic part of the Anno and City Builder playing experience, but compared to earlier titles, is a seemingly under-focused mechanic which becomes more of an annoyance rather than contributing to any real strategic significance for the player. Compared to Anno 2070, which had the typical city-related disasters such as fire and disease, but also environmental disasters such as tornadoes or oil spills, Anno 1800 only has 3 different disasters. Fires can start randomly in your cities based on the calculated fire risk, usually influenced by density of buildings and amount of fire stations in the vicinity. These can prove to be destructive, especially if it hits crucial industries, but overall, with a bit of micromanagement and careful space planning, or the utilization of specialists and items, it becomes nothing more of an occasional nuisance in the late game. Similarly, disease outbreaks can spawn due to high population density, but are likewise alleviated quite one-dimensionally with a hospital. Riots are triggered by low happiness, but with the multitude of tools available to keep happiness stable, this should be the least likely disaster that occurs. It is, however, the most damaging, causing instantaneous loss of workforce and can snowball out of control in large population centers. Alleviated by police stations, the fact that you can prevent riots from happening in the first place by keeping happiness stable or invoking propaganda modifiers means that, again, this event is quite ignorable. It is therefore of my opinion that disasters are fairly meaningless in this game. With enough tools at the player's disposal to prevent or heavily reduce the chances, they become a virtual non-factor in well-planned cities and only serve to punish less experienced players. Even if they do trigger, the consequences are usually so minimal that any effect on your economy and progress is negligible. Expeditions are a new mechanic that adds sort of a minigame that enriches the flavour of the game world and serves as another avenue for the player to search for rewards. Expeditions are unlocked once artisans inhabit your city, and besides some scripted expeditions to unlock the new regions, they are randomly generated as you progress through the game. Types of expeditions include archaeological to search for cultural artifacts, zoological to search for animals to house in zoos, or even pirate hunt missions to bring back an assortment of treasure. These expeditions are ranked by their difficulty based on their skull levels, with harder expeditions having higher chances to bring back rarer items such as epics and legendaries. During an expedition, randomized events will trigger based on the region you are exploring, storytelling a bit of the context of the game world, whilst forcing a dilemma on the player that requires skill checks to pass. Passing enough of these skill checks will keep the crew's morale high, resulting in a successful return with rewards. However, failing too many skill checks and reaching zero morale will result in the complete loss of the expedition and everything you brought along with it. This creates amazing incentive combined with a factor of risk and reward to embark on expeditions, because choosing what type of ship, supplies and personnel to bring is paramount to its success. Certain goods offer certain expedition bonuses, which influence how well you can react to certain events that are triggered during the expedition. For example, having a source of extra rations means you can keep morale up for your crew, or bringing along some medicine goods allows you to pass medicine related skill checks. Every goods in the game is worth something on expeditions, so it's worth experimenting and doing some research to find useful combinations. Furthermore, ship choice is also crucial. Larger ships can carry more goods and thus can diversify your skill checks, as well as having higher base morale to start the expedition with. This is honestly one of my favourite introduced mechanics in Anno 1800 because it offers satisfying rewards and encourages smart planning. Expeditions are a technically free way to flesh out your array of items and specialists, as they don't really require any external commitment, just some collateral on your existing items because, well, you lose them all if the expedition fails. The expeditions themselves play out like a visual novel or roguelike experience, yes, even with the permaloss, so it's such a refreshing dynamic that is unique from the standard city builder strategy gameplay normally associated with Anno 1800. For a game based on a time period where voyages like these were commonplace to further humanity's understanding of the world, expeditions are a wonderful addition that has definitely helped to cement Anno 1800's place in the realm of great Anno titles. Influence sees its return after its introduction to Anno 2205, but plays substantially different from the system in that game. Influence can be summarized as a special resource that is gathered by reaching population milestones and invested in a variety of categories. Most purchases or actions in game cost influence, such as enacting propaganda or building new ships. As you invest more influence into certain categories, they unlock global bonuses related to that category, and thus can be seen as a specialization tool. For instance, investing influence in the construction and maintenance of a large trade fleet increases the speed of all trade ships, Or like we discussed before with population, investing influence for expansion provides free workforce for all your islands. This gives impetus to the player to decide which direction they wish to specialize, as influence is a limited resource and is required quite heavily in the late game. At launch, the influence mechanic was poorly received by the community due to its perception as being obtrusive to the gameplay experience, but recent updates have adjusted influence gain and cost and also allowed its difficulty to be set in the sandbox settings. This has made influence relatively rewarding now as a mechanic and encourages the player to specialize their overall strategic game plan in the late game without being too restrictive as it was at launch. Overall, I still feel like this mechanic could be further improved by providing more substantial bonuses at the higher ends of influence investment, therefore encouraging even more specialized and focused builds, or bonuses if several or all influence categories are achieved, providing the opportunity to pursue a more broad jack-of-all-trades strategy. Monuments are the centerpiece of your cities and their main endgame victory condition. As with other Anno games, the construction of such monuments are monumental feats in their own right, requiring a huge surplus of labor, materials and time. In the base game, the World's Fair is Anno 1800's monument, based on the Great Exhibition of 1851, which was hosted in the Crystal Palace building in London, the cultural embodiment of the Victorian era. Like other games, the World's Fair is built over several stages, each stage requiring a different set of construction materials and labor requirements. Once completed, the World's Fair serves as an exhibition center where the player can host a contingent of the world's architectural marvels, scientific innovations, archaeological discoveries, and botanical collections. Based on how much investment the player puts into the preparations of exhibitions, they can cater to a modest, large, or sumptuous exhibition size, with the rewards scaled accordingly. Exhibitions hosted at the World's Fair are by far the most reliable way to receive items, especially since the category of rewards can be chosen by the type of exhibition you wish to host. Besides being a victory condition and thus a satisfying completion to the game, it also begins the endgame content where the player can focus on culture and city beautification, with 3 of the 4 exhibition types catered towards such endeavors. The World's Fair thus becomes a very useful mechanic to extend the longevity of a game session and rewards the more completionist type players. There is another monument introduced with the Passage DLC, the Airship Hangar. This is also a multi-stage construction project that is exclusive to the Arctic region. Once complete, it allows the construction of airships, fast airborne vehicles that ignore terrain and cannot be attacked. Thus, it is the most efficient trade vessel in the game, extremely useful for transporting goods over international distances. To truly enjoy a city builder game, there has to be some degree of creativity, allowing the player to express themselves in their city's decorative elements. In previous Anno titles, creativity usually took a back seat to the main mechanics, with no real intrinsic value to the gameplay, as it was much better to optimize production chains or economic systems. In Anno 1800, that has all changed, and creativity now has very real, tangible benefits. This is thanks to the introduction of the city attractiveness mechanic, which rewards players for building beautiful and attractive cities. City attractiveness is determined by a score from 6 categories, 3 positive modifiers and 3 negative modifiers that are summed up to produce your attractiveness score. Higher scores create a more pleasant environment for your citizens to live in, making them happier, but also attracts tourists. Tourism is a new mechanic introduced into Anno 1800, serving as an extra income source beginning in the mid-game. Tourists can arrive to your city after the construction of a public mooring, unlocked with 250 artisans, so is available quite early on, and I recommend constructing one as soon as possible to reap the easy rewards. The more attractive your city becomes, the greater the amount of tourists arrive, and thus the more profit your tourism industry generates. Furthermore, higher city attractiveness increases the odds that specialists may immigrate to your city, and this is another method to obtain them. By the late game, with a focus on city beautification and cultural projects, tourism may represent a significant portion of your income and shouldn't be scoffed at. At high attractiveness levels, it is also one of the most reliable ways to spawn rare specialists for free, who are otherwise extremely expensive. Tourism is therefore one of the more gratifying mechanics introduced into Anno 1800, and focusing on it is a very viable late game economic strategy. Let's examine all the city attractiveness categories and options for the players to express their creativity. The nature category calculates the amount of untouched, pristine land on your island. This is perhaps based on the increasing awareness of preserving nature in the 1800s, which saw the first national parks open, such as Yellowstone in 1872. This is one of the more interesting attractiveness modifiers because it discourages aggressive expansion, and if you are a player that focuses on city attractiveness, natural space must be preserved in long-term planning. Nature can be reintroduced later on in the game as well, since electricity and other optimization tools reduce the need for industrial space. There can be considerations to convert save space to natural scenery, and using the lumberjack's hut to manually plant seeds, players can regenerate lost forest and encourage wildlife to return. This is not only appealing to the eyes, but contributes a hefty score to the overall city attractiveness. Culture is another positive category. This is an accumulated score of all the ornaments and decorations in your city, as well as the value of cultural buildings. With the addition of zoos and museums in the base Anno 1800 game and botanical gardens with the Botanica DLC, there is now a huge sort of cultural minigame the players can engage in that is not only a fun and different dynamic from the standard gameplay, but rewarding in itself as it contributes to the cultural score and city attractiveness. Animals, artifacts, and plants can be bought from the NPC Madame Kahina or obtained as rewards from missions, expeditions, or World's Fair exhibitions. Each of these are then showcased in modules in their respective cultural buildings, with the rarity of the item corresponding to how much attractiveness it adds to the overall city. There is some resource investment as modules cost influence, so the player should prioritize which items are showcased. Furthermore, there are also set bonuses. For instance, showcasing all animals of the Arctic Tundra set in your zoo gives you a huge attractiveness bonus and increased specialist visit chance. The creation and curation of these cultural buildings adds an immense depth to the city simulation feel of Anno 1800. It generates a Pokemon-style collect-them-all type objective for the player to aspire towards, as finishing off set bonuses provide strong incentives to further optimize. And also just building zoos, museums, and botanical gardens is extremely enjoyable in the long run because it may touch on niche interests of the player. For instance, adding a dedicated dinosaur area to your museum after you have unearthed fossils, or an Arctic biome section in your zoo after you journeyed to the Arctic and captured some animals there. Large, extensive, and well-curated zoos, museums, and botanical gardens will also generate visual feedback for the player, as many tourists will disembark at your public mooring and head towards them. The 1800s saw the creation of the first modern museums and zoos, especially in London, where London Zoo, Natural History Museum, Science Museum, and other institutions opened to the public, providing a remarkable historical perspective of these facilities and how many of the early exhibits may have looked like. In previous Anno titles, ornaments and decorations were almost completely optional, but since they contribute to the culture score in Anno 1800, there is an incentive to place them around your city. Sure, you could just spam them if you couldn't be bothered, but it nevertheless encourages a more creative approach to city planning. This will highly reward players who like to beautify during their city building experience instead of purely engaging in the economic simulation mechanics of the game. There are many ornaments and decorations in the game, more unlocked through DLC and Ubisoft rewards, and even more added through the modding community. Occasionally, when your population is happy for extended periods of time, festivals may occur. This is an introduced mechanic in Anno 1800 to reward players who keep happiness high, and usually the benefits are reasonably worth it. Festival types occur completely at random, but all of them provide a huge temporary boost to city attractiveness as its own festivities category. Examples include beer festivals, which increases the productivity of alcohol industries whilst providing free alcohol to citizens, whilst arts festivals increase attractiveness and reduces maintenance of public services and cultural buildings. They last for about half an hour, but greatly enhance your city's popularity in that time, causing a surge in tourist income and increasing your odds to spawn specialists. Henceforth, there is strong incentive to keep citizens happy to increase the odds of festivals triggering, due to positive feedback loops that improve city attractiveness, thus making citizens even happier, and this is a major mechanic the player should really take advantage of when playing this game. Vulgarity, pollution, and instability are the three negative modifiers to city attractiveness, and ignoring these can greatly detriment your efforts to promote tourism in your cities. Vulgarity is the presence of unsightly buildings such as pig farms and fish oil factories, whilst pollution occurs in industrial areas. These are usually minimal and can be ignored, but does pose a consideration to move these buildings off your main city island and thus improve city attractiveness. Instability, on the other hand, is very easily preventable, as these include the disasters we talked about previously, fires, riots, and disease outbreaks. As these events can usually be quelled quickly, instability is very much a temporary modifier and won't have a major consequence. But not having them happen in the first place to maintain a stable tourism income is also a consideration. Conclusively, Anno 1800 is the first Anno game that heavily rewards a creative approach to the game, and adds a further depth to city planning, as players will have to consider room reserved for culture and ornaments. Players are therefore encouraged to invest highly in city attractiveness, as tourism is a potentially lucrative income source among other revenue streams. The campaign of Anno 1800 follows the story of the Good family, their attempts to shake off their corrupt uncle, as well as unearthing a threat by the mysterious Porphyrian faction. Throughout the roughly 5 to 6 hour campaign length, you will be introduced to many of the NPCs and their backstory, and get entangled with the rather brief but adequate lore of Anno 1800's game world. More importantly, the campaign serves as a pseudo-tutorial with campaign progression covering many of the new mechanics introduced in this game. The base campaign is thus a serviceable few hours if you're bored, but overall you're not missing much if you don't play it. If anything, it's a glorified tutorial and is recommended for new players to grasp the mechanics. The Sunken Treasures DLC adds a new campaign that accompanies the new region, Cape Trelawney, which was the historic site of a major naval battle between the Crown and La Corona, an obvious reference to the Battle of Trafalgar. The story starts off with Sir Archibald Blake requesting your assistance in finding the Queen, who has gone missing. As you search and uncover the reasons for her secrecy, you are introduced into the new region and embroiled into a race with La Corona's Admiral, Vasco Oliveira, to find the Scepter of Capon, an heirloom of considerable naval prestige, lost in the aftermath of the Battle of Trelawney. By using the new diving bell ship, the player salvages the pieces and engages in a diplomatic gamble to assemble the pieces of the scepter and restore the glory of the crown. This DLC campaign is a vast improvement over the base campaign and ties in well with the mechanics introduced. The scepter itself is a strong reward, a legendary item with one of the best attractiveness ratings when showcased in the museum. The Passage DLC likewise introduces a new campaign that brings the player to the Arctic region, assisting a Lady Jane faithful in a quest to find her husband, who had led a lost expedition to find the Northwest Passage. This is a campaign that heavily references the real-life British expedition of the HMS Terror and HMS Erebus. The ships in this timeline are named HMS Styx and Hades. As the player is drawn into a storyline of intrigue and mystery, new mechanics are showcased, such as the construction effort required to build an airship. This airship is then used alongside help from a local Inuit guide to find the lost expedition and rescue the remainder of the crew. This is a particularly somber story with a more emotional and melancholic undertones compared to the other campaigns, perhaps exacerbated by the dire and cold atmosphere painted in this region. Another legendary museum artifact is rewarded at the end of this campaign, a replica of the HMS Hades. Overall, the campaigns are definitely not major improvements from previous Anno games and can be seen as a continuation of a weak point in the Anno series. If anything though, they assist the player in teaching the new mechanics introduced with each new DLC, and the rewards make them reasonably worth it to play through anyway. Anno 1800 has been unwaveringly supported by the developers since launch, with 8 major patches alongside several hotfixes. There is some criticism to the speed at which issues get patched out. There certainly have also been issues that exist through several updates, and the game's stability can still be questioned to this day. Some updates have even reintroduced bugs previously patched out, and there is a sense that some updates are one step forward and two steps backwards. Regardless, there is definitely a marked improvement of the state of the game over the past year. Based on the turnover of season passes, DLC content, and updates, Anno 1800 is definitely nowhere near the end of its development cycle, and we can expect continuous support for the foreseeable future. With the Old and New World, the Arctic, and soon to be Africa regions represented, there are rumors brewing of a third season pass that may introduce Indian, East Asian, or Australian regions. It definitely hasn't been the smoothest post-release support, with an argument that developers may have prioritized content more than performance or stability. In terms of modding, the Anno series has never had a reputation of strong mod support, with mostly the German-speaking Anno community contributing the majority of mod collections. This has certainly changed with the wider audience and popular reception received with Anno 1800, and we can see a greater number of mods with this iteration. One of the best supported and popular community mods is Spice It Up, a modular compilation of a bunch of quality of life, gameplay, and ornamental mods. Anno 1800 is still not super mod friendly out of the box and does require some manual installation from the user side. Fortunately, however, this game does seem much more mod stable compared to older titles, and the developers have acknowledged that in their engine. For a game with ample mechanical polish and extensive gameplay features to juggle around, it is very easy to see the good, but difficult to evaluate the bad. If anything, it shows this game doesn't deserve much critique, as most of its issues are technical. For example, the stability and performance, and even then that is case-by-case basis for every player. On all other fronts, any issues or grievances are so inconsequential to the playing experience that you'll hardly notice them, and perhaps that is a testament to the depth this game offers. It's telling that I can't really think of anything huge that needs to be changed in this game. I can only offer improvements over existing mechanics. Everything in Anno 1800 operates together in what can be described as a well-oiled machine. That machine doesn't always run at a steady pace, and sometimes you gotta oil it up a bit more, but it does get the job done quite efficiently, and the results are quite spectacular. That's the best metaphor I can come up with in my experience playing Anno 1800. It's familiar territory for Anno fans, for the developers have chosen to return to the classic Anno experience and flesh it out, rather than the more simplistic experience of the last title. Regardless, the setting is grandiose and visionary, a fairly unique time period never explored in the series. Themes of the industrial era mixed with steampunk translate effectively well with the mechanics on hand, portraying the transition of technology within this tumultuous time period. 9 out of 10. With ample graphical improvements, an adequate soundtrack evocative of the Age of Enlightenment, and a modernized user interface that is the best in the series, Anno 1800 pulls out all punches as the latest shining jewel in the series. Its high performance demands and stability issues slightly penalizes this score, however, 8 out of 10. Conclusively, the most in-depth, ambitious, and expansive Anno game ever, filled to the brim with content. Mechanics references themes of the period whilst being rewarding and introducing several new dynamics to the classic Anno experience. 9 out of 10. A vast improvement over the Anno titles of old, with a clear encouragement to focus on city attractiveness thanks to lucrative payoff. The dizzying number of cultural items to display and ornaments to build, coupled with unique methods to obtain them, creates an enjoyable creative experience and allows the player to construct magnificent city building projects. 9 out of 10. A historical weak point of the Anno series sees little improvement in Anno 1800, with the campaign playing out more as a tutorial for new players with a forgettable narrative. Helps to introduce the new mechanics in play even for advanced players returning, however. 5 out of 10. Strong continuous support from the developers with game updates, hotfixes, and plenty of DLC content. A noticeable improvement of the state of the game from release deserves some commendation, though bug fix speed, stability, and mod compatibility could be further improved. 7 out of 10. My overall rating for this game is 8.5 out of 10. As of the writing of this video, the current recommended retail price for the standard edition Anno 1800 game is $60 US. This is a fair and balanced price for the possible hundreds of hours you can commit to this game. Recently, the price stooped to as low as $27 US for Ubisoft's summer sale, and for these prices, the game is quite simply a steal. The deluxe edition includes the Anarchist DLC, which adds a new AI opponent, Dr. Hugo Mercier, and additional features that complement in-game mechanics, such as the anarchy-related propaganda articles or the defection feature to obtain specialists. The deluxe edition also includes 4 exclusive company logos, the game's soundtrack, and digital artbook. Overall, for $10 US, the deluxe edition is arguably a bit pricey for what it offers, which is frankly not much when compared to other DLC. 6 out of 10, and only get it on a sale. Sunken Treasures, on the other hand, is an amazing DLC. For $12 US, you get access to a new region with a huge island for building space, probably essential for all players who are more creative oriented. Alongside this is, in my opinion, a better campaign, new mechanics centered around the diving bell ship to acquire new items. This is a highly recommended DLC and a must buy to extend your Anno 1800 experience, 10 out of 10. Botanica is arguably the weakest DLC out of the Season 1 pass set, but it's also the cheapest at only $8 US, adding the Botanical Gardens building and supplementing the cultural item sets with plants to display around your cities. This is a decent pack for creative enthusiasts, but doesn't add too substantially to the overall gameplay. 6 out of 10, get it on sale or with the Season 1 pass. A content-heavy DLC with the new Arctic region, a campaign, and all of its distinct resources, production chains, and residential tiers, offering a very unique experience. This DLC also features the airship and gas electricity chain. Unlike the Sunken Treasures DLC, I don't rate this pack as much of a quintessential addition to your experience, but still comes highly recommended to extend replayability, an 8 out of 10. It is the most expensive Season 1 Pass pack at $15, so get it on sale or with the Season 1 Pass. For $25 US, you get all 3 previous talked about DLCs, great value, and even more so when on sale. For completionists or players who want the full Anno 1800 experience, Season 1 Pass is a huge boost to content and replayability and comes highly recommended, 8 out of 10. Anno 1800 is a borderline masterpiece, with Blue Byte Studios rising to the occasion with their triumphant return to the classic Anno experience by creating arguably the best Anno game to date, and thus has set a massive benchmark for future games in this series. This is a game choked full of content, but doesn't sacrifice any depth. Although it juggles itself to be an all-in-one city builder, economic simulator, and resource management game situated in a steampunk, semi-historical 1800 setting, it doesn't fail to meet any genre expectations and culminates in a satisfying amalgamation of all its influences, and resultingly a very rewarding product for the end user. This game does sometimes have huge learning curves and may prove daunting to new players inexperienced with Anno titles, but this is the sort of game that's really easy to get into but much harder to master. With the endless tools available to adjust, tinker, and fine-tune, you could pour endless amount of hours into this game and still feel like there is more room for improvement, whether that be optimizing your industry and trade, balancing space management, or promoting creativity in city design and beauty. Never has an Anno game pushed me to learn to play better, but at the same time reward me satisfyingly for doing so. If you've enjoyed this review, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more future content. And if you wish to see more analytical pieces such as these, consider supporting me on Patreon.